Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Baker, founder of Search Engine Journal. Thanks for tuning in today for a very special webinar with our partner, Botify. Cameron Jenkins from Botify is going to be presenting today on an enterprise SEO framework from crawling and conversions. And I'm going to go ahead and go through a lot of the housekeeping. But before I do that, Cameron, why don't you just take a chance to say hi?
Yeah, hi everyone. Do you want me to go into my About Us, Lauren, or?
Uh, let's do that. I'm going to go through basically how the webinar will work, and then after that, you can get started on that front. How's that
Great,
sound?
sounds good. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. So again, thanks for attending today's SEJ Think Tank. As you see at the bottom of the slide, our official hashtag is hashtag SEJ Think Tank. So if you're on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and you want to share with your friends what they're currently missing out on, please feel free to do so. Take snapshots, et cetera, and also feel free to hit up at Botify or at Cami Jenkins in the bottom to let them know that you're attending, or if you have any follow-up questions as well. Just to let everyone know, the slides for today's webinar will be made available, as will video of the webinar. We'll be following up to all of you that have registered with a link to our video slides, and then also an update post on SEJ about the content from today's webinar with Botify. During the webinar itself, we're going to be going ahead and launching a couple of different polls. So if you could please take the time and answer these questions when we launch them, that would be fantastic. They'll be during the webinar, and that will really help Cameron with her overall delivery. And help us get some great information from you on your experiences in the world of enterprise SEO. Also, just from a format perspective, we're going to go ahead and present for about 20 to 25 minutes or so. And then after that, we're going to have an open Q&A. So as questions come up over the course of the webinar, please feel free to type them into the webinar box on your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll be monitoring those questions and asking those to Cameron after she's done presenting. Also, any questions that come up while we're doing Q&A, of course, put them into your control panel as well. We'll try to address everything. If we cannot get everything addressed, we'll go ahead and do some follow-up and include those after the webinar, and include those Q&As on our update on SEJ as well. And I believe that's everything. So Cameron, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, hey everyone. Like Lauren said, my name is Cameron Jenkins. I am the Director of Brand, Content, and Communications at Botify. So I've been in the SEO space for a little over 7 years now. A bulk of my background was actually in the local SEO space on the agency side. So by nature, a lot of my clients' websites were fairly small. For a long time, I think the biggest client I had, their site was like 2,000 pages. But then my agency started expanding and taking on larger websites, larger businesses, things like franchises and health systems. And I remember being pretty stunned when we made the leap, because that was the first time I realized how different SEO has to look as your site gets bigger. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So now I'm at Botify, and our software is designed specifically to help the biggest sites on the web. So these are sites with millions of pages, for example, and we help them improve their performance in search. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like specifically, we've worked with companies like Expedia, Glassdoor, Marriott, and Condé Nast. So really big, sometimes multiple, really complex websites. And we have learned a lot from working with them. So I'm going to be sharing some of those insights today. So here's where we're going to be going. First, we're going to give you the data to show you why huge websites need a different framework for SEO than what many of us are probably used to doing and used to needing. Next, we're going to dive into what we call the crawling to conversions framework. So we're going to show you exactly what that entails and walk you through a case study so you can see what it looks like played out in practice. And third, we're going to talk a little bit about how the structure of your organization can actually affect your ability to implement this framework and be effective with SEO. So I will say that this webinar, it does lean a little bit more toward in-house SEO, but the framework we'll be talking about is absolutely relevant for anyone who works on large websites. So even agencies and consultants as well. And then we're going to end with some actionable tips, some takeaways, and hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A like Lauren said. So as you think of those questions, again, feel free to submit them via the GoToWebinar, and we're going to sort through those at the end. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of kick things off with a poll, which Lauren is going to set up now. So Lauren, take it away.
Absolutely, underway. So I'm launching the first poll now. You should all see a little box pop up in the presentation. What's the primary KPI you or your boss has set for your SEO team? Is it improving Google's crawl of your site, improving overall indexing, improving keyword ranking, improving traffic, or improving revenue? So if everyone could please take the time right now to go ahead and vote. We try to get 75 to 80% on these. I see that we're approaching 60 something percent right now. It's going pretty quickly, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in about 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, final chance. And here we go, closing the poll and sharing the results. Cameron, we have about 78% of attendees have voted, with 35% coming in and improving traffic, right? 31% at improving revenue, 20% at improving keyword ranking, 9 at improving Google's crawl, and then 5 at improving overall indexing.
That's awesome. That's yeah, thank you for doing that. That's super interesting. So this one is definitely hard to answer, right? Because all of these KPIs are important. They all play a role. But I was really curious to see which one of these was the most common as the sort of like end all be all KPI for various SEO teams. So if you were one of those people who picked C for improving ranking, that's super common. Improved ranking is one of those most direct, most visible byproducts of SEO. So it's pretty well known and loved as a KPI in SEO. If you picked E, which some of you did for improving revenue, that can also be common, especially for those organizations that, they get it. They get that SEO is part of their larger ecosystem, right? SEO is a tool, it's a means to an end. So many SEOs actually get judged based on how much revenue is produced from the organic search channel. So, all of these options make sense again, but what can sometimes happen when we're so focused on things like rankings and traffic is that we kind of lose sight of how we get that traffic. And it starts with how Google crawls your site. Enterprises need to be thinking about SEO in this holistic kind of fashion, from crawling all the way down to conversions if they want to be effective. But this is definitely something we don't just want you to take our word for. It really should be the data that's leading the way and telling us how large enterprise websites need to be thinking about SEO. So last year, we decided to do this study with the goal of learning how Google actually crawls the web, rather than just relying on our anecdotal opinions or what Google says about itself. So to do that, we analyzed 413 million crawled pages and 6 billion Googlebot requests that we pulled from those websites' log files. And what we ended up with was one really comprehensive study about how Google crawls the web. We originally presented this at SMX Paris last year. The talk was called "How Does Google Crawl the Web?" And I definitely encourage you to Google that later, check it out. There's the deck that's out there on SlideShare. Check that out in your own time if you're interested in diving into more of those details. But we are going to share the major findings with you today because they reveal exactly why it's super important to have this crawling to conversions framework in place. So what did we find? So if you think about your website as a single unit that's made up of a bunch of individual components, so those individual components being your URLs that each have their own unique characteristics, the sum of those individual parts represents 100% of your investment in time, in money, resources, whatever that you spend on your website at one point or another. So when we averaged all of the data, we found that Google was missing 51% of those pages. And you might be thinking at this point, well, yeah, but that could make sense given all the pages you actually want to be excluded, right? You don't want Google crawling everything. There are plenty of good reasons why you don't want Google crawling everything. But the interesting thing here is that these pages actually represent what we call compliant pages. So those are pages that, in one way, shape, or form, they indicate that you actually do want them crawled and in the index. So those qualities might be things like they have a 200 status code. They're the canonical version of your page. They are HTML content type, and they don't have a no index tag. So by all other measures, these are pages that should be getting crawled, and yet Google is missing them. Another way to visualize this is with this Venn diagram. So a lot of the large enterprise sites we see tend to look like this, where you have a ton of pages on your website and in your site structure that Google is not visiting. And on the flip side of that, a ton of pages Google is visiting that you might not want them to visit for one reason or another. So why on earth is this happening? So for one thing, the web is huge, right? It gets bigger every day. There are trillions of other pages Google needs to get to, which means that Google has this cap or a limit on how much time and how many pages they can get through on your site before they have to move on. And the modern web is also more complex than ever. So Google has to spend more and more time crawling and rendering things like JavaScript. So what we found in the data really helped validate our suspicions, which was that they treat large websites differently than small websites. If you look at this graph here, you can see that as a website gets bigger in terms of how many URLs they have, the smaller their percentage of crawled pages and pages getting organic search traffic. So it isn't as if Google just doesn't like big websites. It's really just that the size and the complexity of the web that we just talked about means that Google is pretty strapped for resources. They might have no issue getting through the content on a smaller site, but this definitely matters for large sites with millions of URLs. So again, we found that the larger the website, the more you'd have to worry about things like crawl budget optimization, because every little thing that can take up Google's time, multiply that at the scale of millions of pages, and that's going to have a drastic impact on how many pages Google is able to get through. So while a smaller, maybe SMB website might not have to worry about crawl budget, and they have the liberty to just jump straight into keyword optimization and rankings, larger sites really don't have that luxury. So our data also revealed that 37% of the pages on large enterprise sites aren't compliant. Now, not compliant is kind of Botify's blanket phrase for pages that probably won't be indexed for one or more of the following reasons. So they don't respond with a 200 status code. Maybe they're the alternate of another page, so they're not the canonical version. They're not an HTML content type, and they might have a no index tag. So essentially, even pages that Google is crawling may still not be added to the index because they have one or more of these issues. Google might be wasting time then crawling pages that have 404 or wasting time crawling pages that aren't the canonical or they're no indexed, which, on a large enterprise site, that could start to hurt your crawl budget. So all of this leads to the fact that only 23% of pages on large enterprise sites receive any organic visits. So to phrase that another way, only 23% of large enterprise websites are working toward driving traffic and driving conversions from search. So you're operating at really a fraction of your capacity because the site is so huge and Google doesn't have enough time to spend to figure it all out. And often, the structure too of the website doesn't make it easy for Google to figure out where to go or what you even want them to look at. So if we want to have any hope of turning that around, we really need to acknowledge that enterprise websites need to take a different approach to SEO. So what does that look like exactly? So instead of starting here and zooming in here at this ranking stage, like many of us in SEO are used to, we have to really zoom out. SEOs that work on these large websites need to look at this full funnel. They can't start with keywords and rankings, or they're going to miss this huge opportunity that comes from further up in the funnel. Because for example, what good would it be to add content to a page or re-optimize it based on your keyword research if Google isn't even crawling that page? Okay, so here's how that framework works. If you think about search as a process, things are going to start to become a lot clearer. So like any process, there's a beginning and an end. With search, the starting point of that process is your website, then how Google crawls it, then how it's added to the index, then how searchers find it and interact with it, right? So you can use that same logical sequence that search has and mirror it in how you evaluate your own website for SEO. So in other words, you can start by taking an inventory of your website. And I will say website here, that's a catch-all for all of your digital properties. So that includes things like your mobile version, your AMP version, country versions, and all of that. So once you have that accounting of all of your pages, what they look like, you can start to layer log file data on top of that to show you how Google's interacting with it. So you get to know which of my total pages is Google visiting and which are they ignoring. And then once you know which pages even have the capacity to show up in search, then you can start layering on data like keyword rankings and CTR and organic visits. So here's another way to visualize that, just in case the GIF was a little bit too much to digest. You want to start by understanding what pages exist on your website. This step is actually usually pretty eye-opening for people, especially say people who work on like an e-commerce website. They might have multiple different ways to access a single page due to things like your faceted nav where you can sort and filter. That can create a ton of different versions of a single page that has the same content. So you might not actually have a very accurate idea of how many pages or what pages are actually in your site structure until you crawl it. So then the next step would be to look at which of those pages Google is actually visiting by analyzing your log files. So the goal of a crawl is to go through your site the way Google would if it could devote unlimited time, unlimited resources to exploring your website. But since Google doesn't have unlimited time, like we've talked about, the second step is really important because it allows you to see which pages Google is visiting versus which they're ignoring. So in those first two steps, you'll likely find pages that Google is visiting that you don't want them to visit, as well as important pages maybe that they're missing. So things like adjusting your robots.txt file to direct Google away from certain pages, updating your sitemap, making sure it only includes those good URLs, removing the bad URLs, like things that have 404'd, improving your internal linking, making really important pages less deep on your site. All of those things and all of those types of things can help ensure that Google's adding your most important pages to its index. Because it's only once a page has been indexed that people can find it via search, right? So in this third step, you're going to want to know how your index pages are performing in those SERPs. So how many impressions they're getting, what keywords they're showing up for, what position they're ranking in, and all of that. So finally, once a page is showing up in the SERPs, it can be found and clicked on by searchers. So the last step would be to evaluate how searchers are interacting with your pages. So how many visits they're getting, if any, what the bounce rate is, what the conversion rate is. So the beauty of this framework is that when you improve one thing, it has a ripple effect downstream. For example, you get Google to crawl more of your pages, you have more pages in the index, and more pages in the index means more opportunities to earn organic traffic and revenue. People, often think of things like ranking and traffic as the growth focused stuff, right? And the things like crawl budget optimization as the technical kind of QA stuff. But the technical fixes lead to growth. They all affect each other. Each step in this process affects the other. So you just have to have the full picture in mind, or you might miss the opportunity. So the perfect example of this is this classifieds website we worked with a while back. The website is, they're an auto marketplace, so it allows you to find vehicles online, and they have millions of URLs. So back in the beginning of this webinar, we said that Google, on average, they miss about half of enterprise website content. Well, in the case of this site, Google was missing 99% of their content. So one of the main culprits was that there were a ton of URLs that were open to Googlebot that weren't even in the site structure. So essentially, Google was wasting all of this time crawling all of these unimportant pages that the company didn't even want in the index. So they hadn't even really been able to identify this before because they've never seen the crawl and compared it to their log files. Once they knew this, though, they made some big changes to their robots.txt file. They did a lot of other crawl budget optimizations to better direct Google to their important stuff away from the unimportant pages. And the result was pretty wild, 19x increase in crawl activity to strategic pages. But like we said earlier, with the crawling to conversions framework, there's this cascading effect. So the crawl improvements actually led to other major improvements, which was 2x the organic traffic within 3 months of doing these improvements. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's great, but I recommend this type of thing all of the time. I can never get it implemented. You know, there's too much red tape, things move too slowly, my dev team is too busy, no one listens to SEO. If you're in that camp, you are definitely not alone. So we work with hundreds of SEOs in situations just like that. And frustrations like this are super common. We found, though, that the SEOs who are able to go beyond recommendations and actually implement this framework, they're set up in the right organizational structure. So that is going to lead us into our second goal, where we want to know, where does SEO live at your organization? There are maybe some of you in attendance who don't work in-house. If that's you, maybe just answer where you think SEO should live or how you've kind of seen it structured in other organizations. So I'll let Lauren take it away.
Okay, fantastic, Cameron. I'm launching right now. So how is SEO structured at your enterprise organization? A, we all live under marketing. B, we all live under the website production team. Or C, some work under marketing and others work under the production team. So if you go ahead and give it a quick vote, see that we're at 50% right now. And like Cameron said, if you're not in-house, then go ahead and answer, please, with the ideal scenario and or where most of your clients have it set up. So we're at 65% right now. I'll give everyone a chance to go ahead and vote. I'm going to close this down in about 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And at 70%, we see that the overwhelming amounts are under marketing at 49%. So almost half of all attendees. 31 are under some is under marketing and some is under the product team, which can lead to a lot of meetings, almost double the amount. And then 20% are under the website product team itself. So it looks like half report up to marketing and half report, or 20% report up to product, and then 30% report to both.
Okay, great.
Close now, and back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for responding to that. So yeah, if you answered A for under marketing, that's definitely common. And this is a pretty debated topic. But traditionally, you know, we found that SEOs have been lumped together with marketing. And it makes sense to a degree, right? Because the things that SEOs do, they do positively impact growth, right? And growth is a major function of a marketing team. However, though, we have been seeing more and more enterprise organizations, structure their SEO teams in both marketing and product. So the organizational stuff, the reason we're talking about that is because how you structure your SEO team really does play a big role in how effective you can be and what SEO is able to accomplish for your organization. So when you have an SEO team that's fully housed in a marketing team, you may be overemphasizing things like adding new content and on-page SEO to achieve, greater keyword rankings and not really being able to do much about things like crawl and indexing issues. We have seen a lot of success from companies who've incorporated SEO into their web product teams as well. So when I say web product team, I'm talking about the team responsible for the website as a whole. So that includes developers and engineers as well. So we've even seen some companies kind of relabel their SEO team into a content SEO division and a technical SEO division. So to think of this in terms of the crawling to conversions framework, the technical SEO team would be the one to own crawling, rendering, and indexing. And they're the ones working with developers and others on the product team to make sure all decisions about the website help instead of hurt the SEO visibility, right? So then you have a more content-focused SEO team. And they may sit, with your marketing team, and they'd be responsible for things like keyword research and optimizing your content, adding new content. And their KPIs would be things like rankings and traffic. So again, there's no perfect org structure. The main thing to take away here is just that enterprises really need to make sure that every step of the search process is covered. So if this subject interests you, by the way, I do recommend reading something we published on the Botify blog recently. And that's an article that is titled, "Where Does SEO Live? Tips for Structuring a Successful Enterprise SEO Team." So we go into a lot more detail on that topic. If you're interested, definitely consider looking that up. So this quote is great. It's from a great Q&A by Scott Brinker. He did this with Jessica Bowman. So she has lots of experience with SEO at these large organizations. In the interview, she talked a lot about how most companies don't even realize that, everyone who's touching the website in some capacity is doing SEO. So it's not just about keywords you add to the site. SEO professionals really need to be embedded with all of the people who work on the website. Otherwise, it's only really going to be a matter of time before a change that, was probably done to improve something like scale or UX or whatever ends up actually tanking the site's traffic. Because, when SEO is relegated to just, the ranking stage of search, for example, they're going to miss those important conversations and they're not going to be able to have a voice when it comes to the decision. So you can see how this organizational setup is really critical to the crawling to conversions framework. Without SEO embedded in the areas that affect crawling, rendering, indexing, ranking, traffic conversions, all of those things, SEO won't be able to drive the change that it really could be driving. So you may be listening to this and you're thinking, well, I don't have the authority to restructure my company's SEO department. But I will say there are things you can do regardless of your position within the organization, within the org chart, that can help you implement this framework. So maybe let's wrap up the presentation portion of this with some takeaways and tips kind of in that vein. So first, let's remember that large enterprise websites, they really need a different framework because they face really different challenges than smaller websites do. About half, and in many cases, like we saw, a lot more of key pages on these websites are being completely missed by Google. And because of that reality, SEOs who work on large websites can't afford to start with keywords, on-page optimization, and rankings. If they do, they're going to miss huge opportunity that could come from removing those issues further up in your funnel in that crawl, render, index phase. So what can you do about it now? How can we start implementing this crawling to conversions framework today? So the first step is really just to make sure that you're armed with all of the data. You can't evaluate and improve your full funnel unless you have a clear picture of your site at each of these phases, right? So you need to crawl your site and take an inventory of everything that's there. You need to have access to your log files so you can see which pages Google's visiting, which they're missing. You need to know how your index pages are performing in the SERPs. which you can get from things like Google Search Console, things like impressions and queries, position, and CTR. And finally, you're going to need your website analytics data so you can see what searchers are doing once they land on those pages. So you want to know things like how much time are they spending on my pages? What's the bounce rate? And are they converting? So without all of these data points and without unifying them and pulling them all together, you really won't have a full picture of your site throughout the search process. If you only ever had keyword data, for example, you might only know what position you're ranking in and not why you're ranking in that position, which could be uncovered through looking at things like the page's crawl data or log data. So having all of this data and unifying it together helps show you the kind of the why behind the what, so to speak. And as a final tip, it's just to get yourself a seat at the table, right? Easier said than done, but the way you're structured and valued in your organization, like we showed, makes all the difference. So if your SEO department sits in a silo away from your development team, or maybe even away from your marketing team too, decisions are going to keep being made that aren't ideal for your search performance. So if you can't get the organizational shift that you need to actually integrate SEO into your product and your marketing teams, I would just start by developing relationships with those teams. So make sure that they know who you are and you can get to know them as well. Develop those friendships, because when you already have a relationship with them, it's a lot easier to share your point of view and learn about their point of view as well. You can do things like connect the dots to show them how certain changes that they made actually ended up hurting search performance, and present an alternative as well. So I think by doing that, kind of developing those relationships and starting to talk with those types of people, they're going to start to learn to lean on you, and hopefully we'll start to remember to ask your opinion before deploying certain changes. All right, so I think that's about it. That brings us to our Q&A. So if you asked a question, now is going to be the time to go through those.
Excellent, thank you, Cameron. And we had a lot of questions come in, multiple ones about content in the presentation, but then also basic e-commerce SEO questions as well, which are fairly pertinent too. So I'll go ahead and get started on the Q&A side. So just to let everyone know, we're going to dedicate the next 20 minutes or so to Q&A. If any additional questions come up, please drop them in the box while we're talking. And I've gone ahead and consolidated a lot of the ones that came in, so I'm going to get started right now. With this framework that you discussed, also work for agencies who work with enterprise clients as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I think so, definitely. Like I said in the beginning, the target audience is really any SEO who works on large websites, right? So whether you're doing that in-house for your own company, whether you're an agency SEO doing this for your client, the framework is more of a mindset shift rather than this like rigid process. So in-house versus agency shouldn't make a huge difference, but there are definitely unique challenges to doing this in an agency, I will say. A good example of that is maybe say you're an agency SEO, you're working with a large enterprise client, and you identify this like robots.txt issue that you need to work with your client's dev team to fix. So it may not be really easy to get those things done if those developers aren't your coworkers and teammates. It might be really hard to get things on their schedule and get them to implement certain things. So the main thing though with this framework is just to keep in mind, the larger your site, the harder it is for Google to get to everything, like we said. So you just really need to run a tight ship when it comes to giving Google really specific instructions, which means that you need to look at every stage of your search process, right? So whether that's agency or you're in-house at an enterprise, that's the main thing to keep in mind, I would say.
Okay, fantastic. Also, would you mind, I know we're on our Q&A right now, but would you mind clicking back a few slides just to summarize the framework for
Yeah,
anyone that's during this as
so
well?
here's the full
Thank you.
picture. Is that the one you wanted?
Yep, that would be
Perfect.
perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So next question is, what type of things can you do to help with the crawl budget so Google gets the most out of your important pages?
Yeah, that's so this is definitely site specific. So you will want to look at your own website's data to see where there is the most room for improvement. I can tell you generally though, some of the biggest things that we've seen that tend to help with the crawlability of your site. So, I mentioned this a few times throughout the webinar, but your robots.txt file is a really big one. That's the thing you can use to tell Google what to crawl and what to ignore. So if you're a big e-com site, which is, I know, a thing that comes up a lot with these enterprise questions. So you might have a faceted nav. You can sort and filter without, changing the content. That's something you can disallow in your robots.txt. So Google doesn't waste its time, crawling all of those duplicate pages. You can also clean up your internal linking. That's another big one for crawl budget. Make sure you're linking to the live, most preferred version of all of your pages. So avoid linking to things that, have redirect chains, avoid linking to the non-canonical, avoid linking to 404s and things like that. And making sure your sitemap is updated is a big one. So include live preferred URLs there too. Make sure you're not leaving out any key pages or important pages in there. And, a lot of that is like cleanup stuff. But there are also, JavaScript specific things that you can look into. So a good example of this actually is we recently had a customer who switched to server-side rendering. So that led to Google, they were spending less time crawling resources like the JavaScript files and making API calls. And because Google had more time to spend on the site, because they were now receiving the fully loaded page, they had more time to dedicate to crawling the website's most important pages, right? So that's great in and of itself. But another byproduct we saw of that was that traffic began to trend upwards at the same time. So moral of the story is to pay attention to what you're making Google spend time on your site and see if you can cut out some of the places where they're spending time on stuff that is not critical.
Okay, great. And I'm glad you touched upon robots.txt because we got a couple of questions about the changes on how Google is treating disallow in robots.txt versus no index on the header page level. So could you go into that a little bit just for a refresher for folks who are listening?
Right, that Google recently kind of specified that if you were using your robots.txt file for the purpose of no indexing certain pages, and that was kind of done by some people, I think for the most part, it seemed like a workaround. If they couldn't actually directly add the no index to the pages themselves on the pages, they were using the robots.txt, but they recently kind of defined that that's not what it's for, and they're going to start that you really need the no index on the page itself is I think what that question was referring to.
Yeah, exactly. And we got a couple about this, like is robots.txt still relevant, things like that. So just as a refresher for everybody, disallow never took pages out of the Google index.
Yeah, so your robots.txt file is instructions for Google's crawler to tell them what to go to and what to not go to, basically. They can still crawl things if they're linked to, for example, so it's not a guarantee, but your robots.txt is a really good preventative measure to keep them away from certain things. Yeah.
Great. Next question. With this framework, do you have to fix all technical issues before moving on to content issues? Should this be done really linear, step by step, or is there the ability to dynamically move around and fix other things that are a little bit more instant while you're waiting around for teams to get approval on fixing more of the technical or crawl related issues?
Yeah. So the crawling to conversions framework, it is a logical sequence, right? Like it's on the screen, you can kind of see it as a funnel presented here, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to complete your SEO work in that order. And I'll explain what I mean, because this could potentially be confusing. Before you can get traffic and conversions from a page, the prerequisite is that the page is in Google's index, right? And a prerequisite for it being in the index is that it was crawled and rendered. So you can see how they're all contingent on each other. But that's not to say that you have to fix every single technical issue on your site before you can get to the content work, for example. You can work on growth and cleanup as on your website as a whole at the same time. But just take, for example, if there's a single page that you're trying to get to rank, if you add more content to it, that's not going to do anything if that page isn't even being crawled, if that makes sense. So on your website as a whole, yes, you can work on those things concurrently, but if you're trying to look at a single page and it's not ranking, adding more content's going to do nothing if Google's completely ignoring the page and hasn't found the page.
Great, great. Yeah, thank you. And even whether you're adding content or editing content, if it's still an overall issue, if it's still buried deep, at least then you can get it ready for when it's findable and indexable when you're improving your overall crawl rate. So
right.
That's a good way to go about it.
Mm.
Any tips for fitting this framework into a holistic view, including marketing, products team, UX, development, and tech team? How much mutual language or background is needed across the board? This is in direct reference to your slide about the importance of taking a seat.
Yeah.
At these tables.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely important to kind of embed yourself into those types of conversations, but that's not to say it's easy, right? Like I did say easier said than done, which for a good reason, which is that these large enterprise organizations, they do have a lot of pretty ingrained processes, and a lot of times it can be difficult to get things moving, get things approved. So that's not to say it's easy for sure, but it is, I think, important to kind of know how those other teams work. I hear a lot of SEOs say this, and I've said it myself, is that we really wish everyone would understand our point of view and understand the changes we're trying to make and understand SEO and value it. But on the flip side of that, that's also important that if we're going to be effective as SEOs, we really need to know how those other teams work as well. So I think it's a lot easier for someone to listen to you and take your recommendations if they know that you're coming from an informed place. There are a lot of times that like a UX team or your developers are making a change to improve something, right? They might be trying to improve the scalability of something on your website, or they might be trying to improve some UX thing. They're doing these changes for a good reason, while they might not know that it's harming site traffic, right? So assume the best, assume that they didn't just do it out of complete, negligence or ill will. Know why they operate, know why they make certain changes, and kind of embed yourself into that process. Because I think coming from that baseline understanding of, I know how you work, is really helpful in terms of communicating and getting those changes at least talked about.
Fantastic. We also had some questions come in that are very similar, coming from the outside SEO consultant side of things, on how to get within this decision-making process. I would like to say that asking these questions before signing the contract is a very good way to do so, because there's nothing worse than entering a project where you're not part of that conversation. And I also agree that it's much more efficient to be able to even lend a couple of minutes of consulting or insight with your development team or your UX or design team when they're about to make a major change, as opposed to having to come in and fix it afterwards. Like you said, it's really night and day. We had a lot of questions come in about improving overall crawl budget. In your experience, or overall experience working with Botify clients, what are 3 or 4 tips or possible, I don't want to say checklists, but I guess, yeah, lists of things that you can look at right off the bat to help with overall crawl budget?
Yeah, so I would just reiterate, I think I mentioned a couple things, so not as a cop out, but those are some of the bigger things, like the robots.txt file. That's a huge one. cleaning up your internal linking. A lot of times that you find on a site that's humongous, has a lot of URLs and has been around for a long time, so common that you're linking to pages that don't exist anymore or have been redirected, not even just once, but like 3 or 4 times. And you're linking to the non-canonical version and all of those things. You're sending Google all of these different directions. And all of that, anytime you do something like that, don't just think about it as one instance where you're making Google kind of follow a rabbit trail. Think about that times a million URLs or however big your website is. So anything that can take up Google's time is something that you should try to cut out, right? And make the most direct path to your important pages. So another thing in that vein is your sitemap, right? Making sure that your sitemap or sitemaps plural, they're updated, right? If possible, include your live preferred URLs. Make sure you're not leaving out those really important pages. I have heard of plenty of situations where just because of old legacy CMSs and the way things were set up, the SEOs didn't even have access to the sitemap. The sitemap was years old. It was not updated at all. I definitely empathize with that. If possible, yeah, that's an important thing. Instead of making, Google guess, give them the sitemap that's the most up-to-date version of your most important pages. And then two, another big component of that was just looking into JavaScript and how that's affecting performance, because when Google is spending time, crawling and rendering these resources, that's time that they could be spending, looking at your other pages. So to look at that, look at your JavaScript and see how much time maybe Google's spending on that and seeing if there's ways to kind of reduce that.
Excellent. So in an ideal scenario, right, would you agree that it's correct to never have a redirect action take place on page and those redirects come from links that are coming off the site?
Say that again?
In an ideal scenario, you don't want redirects happening within your navigation, within your sitemap,
Right.
within internal links on your own site, right? Just like
Right.
links that are coming from off-site.
Yeah, exactly. Because those are the things you have the most control over, right? I mean, it's the site, your own site, you can affect those changes. If there is a link on your site that's linking to, the non-preferred version, or, you're linking to something that's 404, you have control over that, which is awesome. Whereas a link from another site, you might be able to email them and say, hey, can you update this link? But again, enterprise website, that's not something you usually have time for at the scale that you need. So usually in those situations, you'd have to, 301 redirect. But on the things that you can control on your own pages, absolutely update those at the source so that you're linking to only the most direct version of your page.
Let's spoon feed Google exactly what they want, right? And
Absolutely,
not send them in
100%.
every other direction.
hmm
Next question, Cameron. We had a lot of questions come in about e-commerce sites,
hmm
multiple products. So one of the first questions is when products run out. Is it better to serve Google a 404 error, or are there other ways to go about that when products are out of stock or when they're no longer being carried?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and not the first time I've heard that one. I've actually followed quite a few debates on that. For example, people have these product pages where, the product expires, but those pages are still getting a lot of traffic. They're linked to, they, they don't know how to deal with those. So, the product is expired. Is it a bad user experience to keep that page up? Or do you take the page down for a better UX and then risk losing your traffic? I've heard of some people putting up a related product, or maybe even if the product is expired, putting something on their site that says, this is when that product is going to be back in stock again. We anticipate some kind of message like that just to keep the page up, but also kind of improve UX as well, because it can be frustrating. I think we've all landed on those pages where something is expired and we found it in search results, and that's super annoying. So, in an ideal world, I think you get rid of the products that are never coming back, but we have to live in that SEO reality where those URLs could be bringing us a lot of good traffic and link equity and things of that nature. So it's definitely an debate and not something I would feel comfortable saying this or that, just because I think in this kind of, living in this like very subjective SEO time. So I just keep pointing back to the fact that you really have to look at your own website's data and decide what's best for you. Maybe I would encourage you to kind of test small. So test this on a few different URLs and see the results of that. And then, if you're happy with the results, roll it out on a larger scale. But just monitoring and testing small and iterating, that's the advice I would give for something like that, because there are multiple ways to deal with something like that.
I love that, and I love the fact that you brought in user experience, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're a large e-commerce site and you had a really cool product, or say you're eBay and someone was auctioning, I don't know, something crazy that picked up a lot of links, you're probably not going to want to serve a 404 error page that just says, oops, you broke the internet, right? To people that are naturally visiting that page. So that's a good thing to look into from an analytics and just overall usability perspective.
Yeah.
404 errors or 410 errors, which is better for overall crawl budget?
For crawl budget.
Yeah.
Well, so I recently, I believe, saw an article, and I have to, I can correct myself later if I'm wrong on this one, because who can keep up with all of the articles that come out about SEO on a daily basis? But somewhat, I believe this is from a Webmaster Hangout where someone was saying that they treat 410s and 404s the same. Again, our policy is always to test for ourselves and to see what's actually working, because it's one thing for Google to say like, hey, this is how we treat it. It's another thing to actually dig into that data and see how Google's treating those things. So if something has, expired, I've heard in the past, like 410 is a much clearer signal to Google that it's an intentional, I'm intentionally removing this, versus just it's not there, it can't be found. But again, from Google's perspective, they're saying like, well, we get it. You don't have to, it's not that big of a deal. You don't have to specify one or the other, but at the end of the day, you just got to test.
Cool. My understanding is that like you said, 410 is intentional. Like that's a good way to
Yeah.
remember it, right? 410 intentional. But my understanding also is that Google will not revisit the 410 multiple times, whereas they will revisit the 404 because it could be a page that's been accidentally
Yeah, that's a great
taken
point.
down.
Absolutely.
Okay. If there are pages in the sitemap which may be blocked by, maybe they're disallowed via robots.txt, or maybe they're no indexed, or maybe they're redirected, does that eat the crawl budget? Is that
So
a good way to cut back on that?
yeah, I mean, so if something, like I said, your robots.txt file gives instructions to the crawler, but if something is linked to from somewhere else, potentially it could be found. So for example, I mean, I've worked on sites where something was blocked in the robots.txt file, but ended up being indexed anyway. And it's, you have to wonder, why is that happening? Oh, it's because there was a link to it somewhere else that Google could find. So if there's a link to that page anywhere else, I'm assuming, and again, I am not a day-to-day practitioner anymore, so I can go back and correct this if needed. But if there's a link to this page anywhere else, I mean, that Google could find, it's going to try to visit it, even if it's blocked in your robots.txt. So I would try to remove any of those pages from your sitemap, just because it's a signal to Google, like, here's what I want you to find, right? So if you don't want Google to find it and crawl it, it's best to remove those things.
Okay, cool. And I did not mean for this to be a speed round of questions about crawl budget, but we have a lot that have come in,
Yeah, that's fair.
which is super cool. It seems to be, looks like your framework is really on top of mind for a lot of the attendees today.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Okay, also had a lot of questions coming about log files.
Okay.
Any recommendations on gaining access to log files and then integrating them into Spotify or another tool that's being utilized?
Great question. And just, oh my goodness, anytime I see something posted about log files, the comment is always like, this is great. I know how to analyze my log files. I just can't get them, right? Your DevOps team is like, I don't want to, like, why do you need this? This file is too huge. It's going to crash your computer. Like, why are you asking for this? So we actually wrote, I would check this out just because we spent a lot of time, putting this together on the Botify blog. It's called How Can SEOs Get Access to Their Server Log Files? So it kind of goes into detail on everything I would say here. But basically, just the long and short of it is it details different ways for getting access to your log files. It kind of presents some of the challenges that SEOs usually face trying to get those log files. And then it does talk a bit about Botify's process for pulling those log files into our platform. So for example, I know what we do is we have a pretty extensive support team, really knowledgeable, and they work with whoever your team is that handles that, maybe your DevOps team, whoever handles your server log files, and we can work directly with them to pull them in, just so it's minimal to no effort on the SEO's part. They just get the benefit of seeing this data. They don't have to pull teeth to get it from someone. Yeah, so I would check out that article. It's called How Can SEOs Get Access to Their Server Log Files, and it's on the Botify blog.
Awesome. And just a reminder to everyone that's attending is we will send a wrap up with the video presentation deck and then all these great links to the Botify blog that Cameron is referring to all attendees and registrants to today's webinar, along with featuring it on the SEJ wrap up as well. Next question, pretty interesting. Looks like they're about to launch an enterprise site from scratch with thousands of landing pages or e-commerce pages. Do you have any recommendations on getting those indexed quicker or quickly?
You know what? That's a really good question, and something that I think we could put together a more comprehensive answer than I can just give verbally right now. So I'd love to kind of do, this is one of those ones where I'd love to just say, yes, I want to answer this very badly. So we're going to look into that, and I'd like to kind of confer with some of our data strategists here and put together something on that, because that is a really good question. It's something that comes up a lot when you're launching something brand new. You want something in the index as quickly as possible, because the answer is always like, well, it takes time for Google to find and index everything. And some people, you don't have time, or you don't want to take that time, because time is money, especially for an e-com site. So let's definitely, I think we're going to convene and put something together on that, because that's a really good question.
Excellent. And we also had a lot of questions about changing the overall URL structure. This one was about a site that's 3 million pages, and what are the risks of implementing 3 million redirects? So that's probably a really good follow-up.
Yeah, that would be good to follow up on.
We have a couple minutes left here today. The one thing I would say when you're going through a giant migration like that is, especially if you're changing domains, don't become alerted if you do like a site-specific search for that domain and they're still in the index.
Right.
Google will leave them in there for a very, very long time. And it seems like it's taken longer than it used to. It's just a question of what Google is serving and where people are finding right now as well. So that would be a great one to follow up with as well. Cameron, we had probably, I think we've broken our record in terms of technical SEO and crawl budget related questions.
I love
it. on a Search Engine Journal webinar. So just a reminder to everyone, in addition to the wrap up, we're going to be sending over a lot of these questions to Cameron and the team over at Botify, who will be answering. So you might get some follow-ups for these, and then for a lot of the questions which are not specific, we'll be featuring that as a Q&A on the SEJ site. And who knows, maybe down the way we'll implement some kind of a Q&A schema on those pages and see how they show up on the results as well. Would you mind flipping back to the final slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Oops, that's the end of nothing. Here we go.
Okay, awesome. So thanks again. Today's been fantastic. Again, thanks to all of the attendees who took the time to ask some of these amazing questions. We're going to be sending them over. We even had more poll answers than we normally have. So fantastic to see this together. Again, thanks a lot, Cameron and the team at Botify, for coming on as a special SEJ partner for this webinar. It's been fantastic. And our next SEJ Marketing Think Tank webinar will be September 25th, in a couple weeks, from the team over at Scribble Live, about creating infographics. So if you'd like to learn more about the content component of SEO and how that can help, tune in for that, again, on the 25th. Again, Cameron, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it was great to do this. This is great.
Yeah, I can't wait to do it again in the future.
Absolutely.
And I'm also looking forward to talking with the Botify team at Advanced Search Summit next week in DC.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, All right. Thanks again, everyone, for attending. And again, we'll be sending recaps, so stay tuned for that. And again, Cameron, it was great hosting you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.